This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm Carrie Baker, and I'm an associate professor at Smith College. I'm in the program for the study of women and gender. So I graduated from college in 1987, and shortly after that was the Webster decision, which was an early abortion case that allowed the state to regulate abortion more. And I remember, I was a philosophy major in college, and so I didn't know a lot about the law. And I remember thinking, I wish I could understand the law better and understand what was going on and why the court's doing what they're doing. And I remember going to the '89 march in Washington, D.C. and, participating, but not really understanding what it was all about. And so a couple years later, I ended up in the Women's Studies Ph.D. program here at Emory, and it was the first year of the program. And I took a feminist theory class with Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who is a history professor over there, who created the Women's Studies program and taught this feminist theory class. And in that class, we read a lot of theory, and a lot of it was related to political and legal theory. And I remember we read some McKinnon, we read, a number of different theorists, and I remember being really interested in it. And then when I came to the law school, because I was a student here at Emory Law School from 91 to 94, I took another class. It was a class that was joint class between Emory and Georgia State. And it was taught by a professor here at the time, Jennifer Brown, and co-taught by a professor from Georgia State named Mary Bradford. And it was called, I think it was called something like Women in the Law, or I forget what the name of the course was, but we read Martha Feynman's At the Boundaries of the Law. So we read that collection, and I remember how mind-blowing it was. We also read all sorts of other feminist legal theory, Catherine McKinnon and Robin West, and all sorts of material. And then when I ended up back in the graduate program, I took with Beth Reingold in the political science department, took a feminist political and legal theory class. And so all of that really, I think, shaped my thinking as I, sort of progressed through the programs. And I think continue to shape my thinking. And Martha's work in particular does. So my current project, I can speak to that. I'm actually sort of right now, as part of this, and I'll talk about this in a second, part of this visiting scholar position, really trying to take vulnerability theory and applying it to my current research project. So what I'm doing is I'm writing a history of activism against commercial sexual exploitation of youth and what's now called domestic minor sex trafficking. So it's activism from 1970 till today that is about trying to treat youth better, provide services to youth, reframe how we think about youth. And so it's really a historical project. I'm using archival materials. I'm looking at the issue historically. But now that I have a draft of the manuscript, I'm trying to work more along the lines of thinking about theory and kind of how this movement's developed and what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses, where are the gaps. And I found vulnerability theory to be really helpful in thinking through that. So it has, and again, I'm still in the process of thinking through this, but just as I've begun, I'm thinking of three ways in particular that I think vulnerability can help me in doing this work around this current project. And one is that vulnerability theory, rather than looking at things at an individual level, it takes things to a structural level. It looks at the ways in which institutions or sort of even ideologies in society contribute to social problems, rather than just saying, oh, look, it's an individual juvenile delinquent child who can't who got herself involved in prostitution, or, oh, look, there's an individual bad guy who lured her into prostitution. Let's arrest him and throw away the key, and then the problem is solved. It's an approach that says, well, how has society failed this child, or this youth? How have the systems in our society that address vulnerable people failed those vulnerable people? And how can we rework those systems to try to better address this problem? And so that shift, I think, is something that's central to vulnerability theory. And in particular, thinking about the responsive state. How can the state reform or change in ways that can help build resilience? And in particular, thinking about young people, in what ways has the state failed to support them, and in what ways can we change the way the state responds to youth to be more, to help them develop resilience and more, to have the tools to be able to address the situations that they're in, whatever those situations might be. The second thing that vulnerability does that I think can be really useful is theorizing a more complex subject. So and this is really true in the area of youth exploited in prostitution, the ways, and this is something that I've looked at historically, the ways that discourses around these youth are framed is that they're naive, they're ignorant, they're passive, they're victims, they're only victims, and they're not seen as heterogeneous, they're not seen as complex subjects, and that's something that Martha has done in her work, is thinking about the ways in which subjectivity is complex. It's not like we're independent, autonomous adults, or we're vulnerable, dependent children, or elderly people or disabled people, whatever, that agency or subjectivity is complex, and that even somebody that is in a vulnerable position might also at the same time be able to exercise agency. And so centering that complex study, that subjectivity, and then building policy off of that, I think is a central insight of vulnerability theory, and something that really can be useful with regard to policy around commercial sexual exploitation of youth or domestic trafficking of youth, whatever you want to call it. And something that's really been missing. It's been missing both from the discourse around describing the social problem, but also it's been missing in the legislative and policy responses to the problem. And again, I'm not the only person that's raised some of these issues, but what I think is helpful about vulnerability theory is it's a sort of developed theory that you can import into thinking about an issue and then really go deeper and expand it more. And so while I think pieces of this analysis are already out there, I think my hope is that in applying it to looking at this long history of this movement, that I can maybe go a little deeper in this analysis and really pull things together. And then the third really helpful thing about vulnerability theory that I'm going to be exploring more as I work on my revisions of my book is how, certainly in dealing with youth with regard to involvement in the sex trade, but in the society generally, we have this mythology that's reinforced by the law that when you hit 18, you are an independent person. You lose a lot of different kinds of social supports. You gain rights too, but you lose some social supports like child welfare supports, flawed as they are, and you gain other autonomy like the right to not have to get your parents' permission, or the right to, work or engage in other kinds of behaviors, enter into contracts. But this artificial line, I think, deserves this issue tremendously, because first of all, if you have grown up in the sex trade, or even if you've just had a few years in it, often you have a lot of vulnerabilities as a result of that, and you haven't been able to develop resilience because of the trauma or the exploitation that you've experienced. So it's not like at 18 a switch is flipped and all of a sudden you're an autonomous individual who can take care of yourself, and now you get arrested and put in jail. No, I mean, and I think Martha really emphasized, or Professor Feynman really emphasizes this, which is that Vulnerability, it's developmental, it shifts, it might increase or decrease over lifespan depending on what experiences somebody has. But that certainly for young people, it's not like you turn 18 and a switch shuts off. And I think going both ways, I think that a 14-year-old can be very resilient and can be very active and have a lot of agency. But if they're treated like they don't have that or can't have that or are not capable, that can disserve them. I mean, you can have a 14-year-old who can get a job, who can take care of themselves if they'd only be allowed to. But because we have these artificial laws around child labor and around the rights of parents and around assumptions of incapacity for young people, that person won't be well served. Whereas you might have somebody who is 19 or 20 who still needs a lot of guidance and support, but they lose that, because of this sort of fiction that they turn 18 and they're autonomous, independent subjects. So I think that those three aspects, this idea of a structural analysis versus an individual analysis, the idea of theorizing a more complex subject, and the idea of questioning the bright line of majority age. All of those three things I think can be very useful, at least my research. I'm sure there's more, and I'm going to continue to look for it, but those are the ones that I'm currently working with. So my book is more of a historical book than a theoretical book. I'm trying to tell the history of this movement and how things have evolved. But there's a lot of theory in it and there's a lot of analysis in it, because what I'm looking for are patterns, are why does this issue get a lot of attention at particular periods and not at other periods? What kind of policy responses over time have emerged and have they been effective? And so I think that one of my goals of the book is to put this issue in historical context so people realize that it didn't just get invented, that there's a long history and that we can learn from that history. And then I think by looking at that history and seeing patterns and seeing successes and failures, that can inform our current our future trajectory and how to deal with this issue. And I think that vulnerability theory and theorizing this history and the policy responses of the past can be helpful in guiding future policy responses. I think often activists and lawmakers are in the trenches, they're at the grassroots, and while I think there's a lot of theory and action that can be really smart, I think that sometimes pulling back and looking at the big picture, that can actually be very helpful too. The key, though, is that then to funnel that back down to the grassroots and to people that are working on the issue. And I'm a huge believer in that. I write in a way that's accessible so that it is so that all kind of folks can read it. But I also do a lot of work in the public sphere, like I write for Ms. Magazine, and I write my blog for Ms. Magazine, and I do other things where I try to take these historical, theoretical, scholarly insights and then feed them back out into the movement. Women's studies grew out of the women's movement. Some critique it for being disconnected to the women's movement now, but I think there's a lot of people within the field who are channeling that knowledge back into the movement. And I think we need to be intentional about that and really think about ways of making the work that we do in the ivory tower useful to people on the ground. And at Smith we have the Steinem Project, which is all about that, connecting the women's movement to scholarship in history and academics, connecting our students with social movements so that they can learn in the classroom and then go out into the field and think about how what they've learned applies, and then bring that back and really develop them as activists and as scholars and as thinkers. So I guess that's where I see some of the potential for the translation, through our students, but also through our public scholarship. And through maybe our academic scholarship too, if we can write it in a way that's accessible to people. So a few things. I graduated from Emory Law School in 1994 and from the Ph.D. program in 2001. And so one reason I'm thrilled to be back is I'm reconnecting with all sorts of old folks that not old folks, young folks, but folks that I knew back in the day, and then current people in these institutions. And that's exciting for me. And I really like the idea of reconnecting with my alma mater. I also really value the opportunity to deepen my relationship with Martha Feynman, who I have admired for many, many years. I've read her work. I've read the work that's come out of the Feminism and Legal Theory Project and the Vulnerability Initiative. And so strengthening that connection, and I'm really hoping to participate more in some of the workshops in the future. And I know that the Vulnerability Project has had workshops at Smith. I hope that can continue. And so building that connection is one of the reasons. And then I really value the opportunity and appreciate the opportunity to share my research and get feedback, particularly around, generally, but particularly around this area of vulnerability theory and how it can apply to this issue, because I think there's a lot of potential for it to apply. To be, for me to develop more explicitly how this theory can be useful for my particular project. So I would think those are the main things.